Joel,
All right,
thank you
cool.
so much for your time. Really appreciate you jumping on here. For the listeners at home, you tell us a little bit about your background, your motivation, and kind of where you are currently.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned motivation in there. Usually it's just background, so it's like what motivates me to get out of bed every day.
Yeah.
Um, well, I quickly just my story
Uh-huh.
is I've always been a student of human movement and performance from as young as I can remember, age 5. So
Mm-hmm.
this is just in my blood, in my genes, I guess you
Yeah.
could say, whatever. And then it manifested itself into being basketball and track and field in high school as an athlete. I
Mm-hmm.
think where you were as an athlete is really important. I think we don't talk about that enough because I
Yeah.
think who you are determines
Mm.
how you coach
Yeah.
anyways. And so those were that was the bias. Those were the lenses that I saw the athletic world, and eventually a track and field athlete in college. And I decided to. I was kind of torn. I was like, okay, I'm either going to do strength and conditioning or I'm going to do track and field.
Yeah.
And I think through some internships and just the way that my mind worked at the time and how I saw the puzzle,
Mm-hmm.
I did track and field for 6 years, and with strength and conditioning as kind of the lower side thing.
Yeah.
Um, and then it flip flopped. I did track and field at a place called Wilmington College for 4 years. It flip flopped, and then I became a strength coach,
Mm-hmm.
primarily with the track coach being the smaller end, becoming the smaller end like club track and stuff like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And so I've been doing strength and conditioning for the last 6 years at UC or no 8 years. This is my 8th year at UC
Okay.
Berkeley, and I've been working mostly with the aquatic teams there. Train a lot of great athletes, work with a lot of awesome coaches. I
Yeah.
also work with men's tennis,
Yeah.
and then am the owner of Just Fly Sports.
That's awesome. And how is managing both of those? Is that difficult in terms of time or?
Yeah, I do get asked that question a fair amount. I just think that you just have to be efficient with your time. I look at when I first started at Wilmington College, it was funny. Like I mean, I was not a
Yeah.
professional in terms of like what it takes to be a successful coach individual in the field when I started that job.
Yeah.
But even still, I still was pretty driven and I wanted to be great and I wanted to make at least some good use of my time.
Yeah.
And I was blown away by at least like there was one individual there who would just like spend a lot of the day playing Tetris on Facebook. If those when I hear it's listening is old enough to remember when Tetris was on
Yeah.
Facebook, or all those games where it's like it's kind of like Peloton or I don't
Yeah.
know, it's like a globalization,
Yeah.
who's got the best score, whatever.
Yeah.
And I couldn't believe it. And I was like, man, like you guys just sit around and like a lot and just
Yeah.
like chit chat and do things. And so I think my day is just insanely streamlined. It's
Yeah.
like very, very regimented. I try to wake up pretty much the same time,
Yeah.
about 5:50. And I try to have it's just a tight ship until about 6:15. Then after that's just family time. So
Yeah.
yeah, I try to make sure I'm just as efficient as possible with any free time in the
Mm-hmm.
day. And I like it that way.
Yeah.
It would be almost anxiety provoking for it to be and that's not a good thing by
Yeah.
the way,
Yeah.
but right now in my life it would be anxiety. I'm hoping in 5 years it won't be. So anyways,
Yeah, fair enough. Okay. And you kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier, right? But what would you say your passion in life is? Why do you get up? Why do you do what you do, you know? Yeah, let's go ahead and go with that.
well, that's a good question. I think a lot of those things, a lot of our motivations, a lot of it we know, but a lot of it we don't know. In the sense of, I think a lot of things, like every single coach
Yeah.
is going to say, well, I do it to help people.
Yeah.
Of course. Well,
Yeah.
it feels good to help people, of course, but there's also, that's not the only emotion. A lot of people are doing it because there's unfulfilled things from childhood,
Yeah.
reasons to acquire love. I'm not going to go off that deep
Yeah.
end of things. And I have been down that rabbit hole as
Okay.
to exposing my own like motivations. And a lot of it
Yeah.
does come back to being loved and respected.
Yeah.
But I think that, well, I'll just say this. One is just I was born for this. Like
Mm-hmm.
I was born as a maximizer, a coach, a
Yeah.
student of human movement, and everything that goes into not just being good at jumping higher, running faster, but also the connectivity of excelling as a team at a team sport.
Yeah.
And that was one of the things that really has been a teaching moment for me as becoming a strength coach. As much as we hate to admit it, sometimes a vibe, as my friend Paul Cater and mentor Paul Cater says, the energy of the room
Yeah.
it might be the big part of our job. And the coaches tend to see it that way,
Yeah.
I think, if you look at who and what people get hired for football, strength coaching jobs and
Yeah.
those type of things.
Uh-huh.
It's easy to hate it, but it's important. And so just seeing like group cohesion and the
Yeah.
greater purpose when a group of individuals can come together in a like-minded situation is really powerful.
Yeah.
And so My motivation is basically the use of sport and human training as a microcosm for everything greater. At least that's where I'm headed. I'm still figuring that out, but
Yeah.
it's our greater purpose is to be the best we can be in either the individual or group level. And so
Yeah.
the more I can learn about that, the better it is.
Yeah. No, I love that. Okay. So let's dive into that training a little bit, right? And so starting this thing off, let's go plyometrics. What are your recommendations for implementing plyos, right, across different age groups, for example?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I've definitely worked with a variety of age groups. Like club track, I started, working with kids as young as 8 and 9 years old, and
Yeah.
the medium track and field. And it's funny, like I've had this. One day it just really hit me. Like I got these kids, and they're doing. I don't run their warm up. These kids they're 8 to 14 years old, and they're warming up. And on the infield, there's kids about the same age playing soccer.
Yeah.
And these track kids are all doing the standard, like all these stretches and all these positional, like looking sprint drills and these things that all the parents probably look at and like, wow, these kids are learning to run fast. But I'm looking at it and I see the kids playing soccer in the infield, and I'm like, all these kids on the track should be playing soccer for their warm up. They should not be doing this stuff. Like, and by that I mean a lot of what we call plyometric is manufactured on some level. Like we invented it. It's not any more special than the soccer's plyometric. Basketball's plyometric. And if you're a kid playing on the playground and jumping off, I see 4-year-olds jump off like a 4-foot, thing and block into the sand on the playground. That's a plyometric. I remember there's a playground in my hometown of Berkeley, and there's like this turtle that's like a big kind of ceramic-y, I'm not sure what's made of turtle. It's about maybe 3 feet high. And there was some girl who's maybe 4 or 5 jumping off this thing landing with super like stiffness, like just sticking the landing like a boss. And I was looking, of course, me, I have all my like mentors and podcasts, so I'm like, wow, her feet have hyper arch, like she's got those toes that really like have that, her arches are floated. But that's just from playing, that's just from being a kid, and so I think that we discount the organicness potential of movements and things like that. And so a long story short is I don't count plyometrics for kids. To me, it's just, can I give them a new problem to solve? And to me, I don't look at the intensity. I don't want the problem to be that of just something that's more intense. And I think it's very easy to do that. Like hurdle hops. Okay, let's line up some banana hurdles or some, 12-inch banana hurdles and do single leg hops over it. Well, now you're overloading maybe the intensity of the single leg, but to me, that's not necessarily as important as a new motor problem to solve, because what's holding most athletes back, especially on the high level, is just the literacy, like of being able to do a lot of movements and sense their body well. And then power gets added onto that later. And so I think it's a Western, I'll say this too. My mind is biased against really super quantifying things, because it's just not the way my brain works. I'm not good at it. So of course I want to
naturally, right? Naturally,
it's not the way my brain works. So I'm not the guy to go to ask numbers. I'm more of esoteric in that stuff. So we'll just do. It's like we will do some low intensity movements on that level, but to me it's more of a how well are you doing it thing, and then can you maybe integrate it into something else that you're doing. So I'm not a big. I can tell you, like, I can tell you in a high performance model, I can give you some numbers. Like when you are to that point where you are coordinated and you are ready to roll, and you're 18, 19, 20, like bounding volumes, usually like between 150 on the low end to 300 meters on the high end if you're super elastic. Depth jumps under 20. Some people say you do up to 40, but I'm more cautious in that realm. I'm always rather go under than over in that stuff. And hurdle hops maybe 40 or less. So those are some general, like high, and once you're ready to roll, those are kind of some general numbers to play with. But with kids, I don't. And anytime you have low intensity, it's like the NSCA is like a 200 ground contacts. I'm like, I don't know, what were those ground contacts like? It's just so. And compared to a game of basketball, it could be nothing. You might jump maximally 100 times you play basketball and land in all these different ways. So it's just. We like to quantify a lot of things. I will say that. I'm biased. I'll say that. Hopefully you got something for that answer.
No, I like that, and I think it gives a lot of value, because again, kids, right? I don't think we necessarily need to be like pushing them, right? Because when you start to track volume and stuff, you do it so you can start to push them and like really progress them more rapidly. Whereas, like you said, I think kids, we just got to give them problems to solve so they can develop right? And we can't really say how fast or slow they develop, right? That's kind of, that's that chronological versus, they just got to learn. They got to process. And so I think that's highly valuable, I think a really good answer. So I appreciate that. And then with those volume numbers recommendations, right, are those kind of anecdotal, or have you seen those across the board within track and field, or what is that like?
Yeah, those numbers are a little more track and field oriented.
Okay.
And so if you're a track athlete, you are, I would generally, as a rule of thumb, I should have given some more context there. Sorry, I would half that for the most part for a team sport athlete, just because, look, if you're in track and you're a jumper, you're probably pretty darn elastic and good at that stuff.
Yeah.
If you're not, you probably, I would just lower the volumes and everything. So kind of basic rule of thumb there.
Okay. Fair enough. And then moving forward a little bit, right, into some of the sprint training, what you're really known for. I mean, you're obviously known for all things, track and field, but let's dive a little bit more into some sprint training, right? So what are some recommendations that you have with implementing sprints and stuff across different age groups? Does it mirror the plyos, or what does that look like?
Yeah, speed training. It's funny. I feel like I used to be the vertical jump guy kind of, and then maybe I'm the speed guy. Maybe I don't know what I'll be in 3 years.
I feel like you're a little bit of everything now. Yeah.
Yeah. So I look at sprinting again. I look at it more from a technical and skill and coordination standpoint. And Darian Bauer has really drilled that into me in the sense of, again, it's a clash of models, and the sprinting is the best thing to look at in terms of, well, how do we coach athletes? Because a lot of times we'll say, okay, here's a group of athletes. Let's say it's football.
Yeah.
And okay, we're gonna warm up and do a bunch of A skips and B skips and straight leg bounds and make sure your arms are all lined up and all this stuff. And I think that the problem with a lot of, I'm not saying that stuff's bad, like at all. I think it's easy to have a contrarian bias, especially once you're exposed to other ways of thinking that make sense to you, and you have these aha moments, and then it's very easy to go back to everything you used to do and say, oh, that doesn't work.
Yeah.
That's not true. I think is fine. But I think that the problem can be, some athletes will do that and be totally fine. And it was David Weck, who was on my show. He's the inventor of the Bosu ball, but a lot of other cool inventions like pulsars and like they're basically little vibrational units in your hands that give you better feedback, and you run faster with them. And he talked about a guy warming up for the 40-yard dash who's warming up with all these A skips. He's very rigid, and when he does it, straight as a board, everything is straight and lined up. Goes and does the 40, runs completely different.
Yeah.
A lot of twisting and torque. If you imagine a car going from first gear to sixth, that first gear, there's a lot more twisting and utilization of frontal and transverse plane to get going, which is a paradigm contrast against everything you see in sprint drills.
Yeah.
But that guy could switch it off. Like that guy could just switch it off, be an athlete, no problem. There's people who don't switch that off. I've had a lot of, and that's where we get those things where, oh, this guy's the king of the sprint drills, but then he actually sprints and he's slow.
Yeah.
Usually you see those people who they're doing sprint drills and you can see their attention is really getting everything lined up, and they think that if they get in this position, they're going to be faster. And that's the biggest fallacy, is if we get in this magic position of knees up or the hand, hip in the pocket or something, that's the furthest thing from the truth. And I talk to my buddy Paul about this, is that's really turning athletes into robots more or less.
Yeah.
And so I think that as a rule, like just scanning when you're doing that stuff, just scanning athletes to see where their awareness is and if they're able to react more to their own body. Basically, is it more like a dance, or are you more like a robot? Are you able to sense and with your body?
Yeah. Or
are you just trying to find a position that the coach told you to go to?
Yeah.
And so it's a little bit more about the essence thing, because if you watch, like, if you do watch track and field, and even there's stuff in the combine too, but I'll give a track example first, is the guys who are hyper coached up in the start when they're coming out of the blocks will always get smoked out of the blocks because what they're doing is they're trying to hit a position, whereas the guys who are faster are letting their body work. They're just letting their body work and utilize all plates, and it looks different. There's twisting and there's these things going on, but they're faster. But I was watching, a buddy of mine, Mike Kozak, sent me a video from the combine. He was a lineman running the 40. And the first 10 of that combine, and that is more similar to what he does instinctively every single day, right? A very short free. So his first few steps were instinctive and really fast. But as soon as he gets to 10 meters, where someone coached him up, his timing gets totally thrown off, because someone said you need to start getting your knees up. Yeah. And what was happening was his knees were getting up faster than his hips were projecting. So it's not helping him. Like
Yeah.
it's just that we tend to just hold on to these cues and positions. And so I would just say the biggest thing is just being a student of what makes people fast. And there's just no substitute for watching a tons of video on these
Yeah.
things. And then not holding to these rigid positional guidelines,
Mm-hmm.
and then being exposed to speed in a variety of mediums in a variety of games, like doing all these sports, doing track and field.
Yeah.
And the human body will adapt as well as it can given what it has to offer. So
Yeah.
I mean, unless you have like your posture and your pelvic alignment is shutting you down for some reason, and
Yeah.
then you have to do something in the weight room or something to correct that or work on that. But
Yeah.
for the most part, I think a lot of times with the technique, we tend to mess athletes up a little bit more than we just need to think more deeply about the how and the why and how athletes are processing what we're saying. And we need athletes sprint in their sport
Yeah.
and learn from that.
Okay.
and not just assume that there's a positional model on the
Yeah.
track that's perfect for everybody.
Okay. And so with that, do you think that the that rigid positional model is beneficial if taken more loosely, just to help kids understand like some basic reference points, or do you think that it just takes kids out completely?
I just think it's how the kids process it.
Okay.
I think that, and this was in a little bit, and this is some things I've been thinking about, like, in Franz Bosch's stuff, you have attractors and fluctuators.
Yeah.
And the attractors are basically these little black holes that attract a position. Like these are the general positions that all good athletes get into. And it's true. Like if you're going to be a great sprinter,
Yeah.
there's some general guidelines as to there's some certain ways that you are not going to run and be in the 100-meter dash final, bar none.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like some certain things that have to be adhered to.
Yeah.
But the question is how do you get to those positions?
Yeah.
And just saying go to the position is going to usually cause a compensation somewhere in the chain. Something to get to that position, something's going to happen that shouldn't be happening, basically.
I got you.
Like for this football player, for example, he beyond 10 meters, his knee was lifting faster than his hip was coming along for the ride. Basically, his knee was beating his hip to that position where things need to start proximal and explode outwards. So if someone would have said, hey, think about your hips projecting, to have an awareness of how your hips are projecting and maybe do some sensory work before that, maybe the hips projecting would have brought the knee to an appropriate position. Although research has shown, analysts of the best 100-meter runners, that knee lift doesn't determine the fastest guy in the 100-meter dash on a world level. So, that's, if that doesn't do it for you right there, but like, for example, like Franz Bosch, I think a brilliant guy, and he's on to something in the sense of, he calls it hip lock. And it's this position, it would be really hard to describe without a video, but basically, like if you look at a really fast guy doing a sprint start, you'll see this position where the leg that's swinging in space is internally rotated. It's like the foot's kind of almost swinging out to the side, and the knee has crossed the midline towards the other side. So the swinging leg has reached this very not straight and oblique angle to the body.
Yeah.
And it'd be easy to say, and I see this in those types of training videos, and a lot of like the water bag stuff, where people are trying to finish everything in that position.
Yeah.
But the problem is not so much, it's how did you get to that position? And how I'm learning Darian Barr is a lot of how you get to that position is how the leg on the ground is pushing off, because for every action will yield an equal and opposite reaction.
Yeah.
And so the leg on the ground has to be pushing in a manner that allows the opposite leg to swing in that internal rotation paradigm.
Yeah.
I hope, does that make sense? I'm getting, I just want to make sure I'm not like, trying to get to, it's like a visual thing in your head, right? And you're describing it. It's like, I hope this isn't too technical.
No,
so does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I really do like it. I think it's good to be exposed to this kind of stuff, because most people, if we're talking specifically right, young coaches or more college coaches, they're exposed to that straight line, rigid type stuff. So I think even just hearing this is going to start to get some wheels turning. So yeah, by all means, don't hold back on any of that kind of stuff. So that's fantastic. And then even with that, right, moving forward a little bit. So read your book, fantastic text by the way. But diving into some of that, right? Will you talk about like biasing, medial arch versus lateral arch for certain things, and then also how would that reflect more in a team sport setting? I know the book is more focused in track and field, but
thanks for that. And speed strength and the medial and lateral arch, and these are all things that I've learned from a Darian Barr. And I think that It is, if anything, and actually I'll say this, is that hip lock thing I was just talking about.
Yeah.
That comes from the ability to get inside edge on the leg on the ground.
Okay.
So to be able to powerfully access the medial arch of the foot. And you can't really, there's the foot is insanely complex. Like that's just the simplest way of putting it. There's definitely other things like the transverse arch considerations. But there has to be this action off the inside edge. And so that's the thing is you see a lot of these drills to get to that final position of that hip lock. But the question is, well, are you accessing inside edge optimally to get to that position? And then in getting to inside edge, that happens on bent leg. Like if you look at the way that we did, this was a great podcast I did with David Gray, a therapist and kinesiologist in Ireland. But basically, you don't, as soon as you fully straighten out your knee, you can't really pronate. That's a supination. That's for simplification, just straightening the knee is more of a pinky toe ball, the pinky toe side mechanism. That's or a locking of the foot, and locking is important. It's not like it's not important. But the pronation, or getting to the inside edge of the foot, or accessing the medial longitudinal arch system of the foot, which is our spring, that's our catapult. Accessing that catapult is done on a bent knee. And someone's doing that well when they're not necessarily, and that's another thing is we coach triple extension. We coach the position. But it's like, well, how did you get to that position is the big thing. Like watch some of the world's best accelerators, or Christian Coleman, who broke the 40-yard dash record and the 60-meter world dash record, and you'll see a paradigm of incomplete knee extension, because you can't, if you just hit the position, those post positions where the whole body is straight from head to toe, and you prioritize that, you screw up pronation. You screw up getting to the medial arch of the foot. You screw up the release of energy from the Achilles tendon, because and the thing is for young coaches, by far, and I was like this. I'm not talking as if I've had the keys to the kingdom, because I learned this stuff in the last 3 or 4 years. And it's come through an pretty intensive mentorship. This information just isn't. This isn't the zeit. If you call it the zeitgeist, is like the overarching philosophy of the time. This isn't. I mean, strength and conditioning and sports performance is a young industry. I mean, we're everything else. I mean, you look at even medicine didn't even get halfway decent until the 1900s. I mean, it was worse to go to the doctor than good to go back, back in the day. So it's everything evolves over time, and I think we're in a process of evolving. So I think this by far it's the easiest thing just to say, hey, hit this position, because I don't know, these good athletes get in this position, but it's like, well, how did they get in that position? For sure. Did they? Because there's little check boxes along the way that you have to tick, or just going there screw it up. And a good example, and again, this is a track example, but I think it can make a lot of sense. And if we're talking triple extension, is a lot of people are familiar with Ben Johnson and Carl Lewis, so two sprinters who were completely opposite ends. Ben 5'9", and they both, I think, use steroids. I mean, Carl, I don't want to point fingers, but everyone says that everyone in that world record race where Ben Johnson ran 9.79 and Carl ran 9.85 or something like that. They said apparently everyone in that race was on steroids, and the one guy who wasn't got last, goes the story.
Okay. Makes sense.
So, anyways, but if you watch Ben Johnson go out of the blocks, he hits triple extension, where Carl does too, but Carl was coached to that. Ben did it because he was just so dang explosive and a little bit shorter and smaller, more compact. By the time his pronation went off, it was so powerful it shot him to that position. Versus Christian Coleman's timing delay works a little bit differently than Ben's did. They both. So it's more about the little nuances and the little timing pieces than it is hitting that. Some people can hit that triple extension, but it's just because their power is so insanely high, it just shoots them to that position. If you think of it longer, it will mess you up. I almost forget what I was even talking about right now.
No, and
I have something with teach. Yeah, you have to reiterate the question. I was thinking, I lost in my own head.
No, I think this is good, and then just for the listeners too, I think it's also important that. If I'm correct, right, that we're talking about more acceleration for this incomplete extension, correct?
Oh, yes. Well, even top end speed. By the time the push hits, by the time the foot it has done its work, you're also in incomplete extension.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
it's you might get to complete extension in top end sprinting, but by the time you're there, you're done like pushing against the ground, if that makes sense.
Okay, and then kind of going back to that earlier part that we were starting to get into. So the question kind of was, how do you bias drills for medial arch with, right? How do you do it with track, and then how do you kind of transfer some of that stuff to team sports where you might not be going in just a straight line?
Oh, right on. Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the team sport thing because it's easy to get buried. I mean, this is why I've been in the world of strength and conditioning. I need to like port this all over. And so my primary land sport is tennis, which is awesome because it the paradigms by which they move is different in many ways than than a jumping sport like basketball and those type of things. But I've observed the best athletes in tennis over time, the best movers, and there's some trends that they all do really well. And so for inside edge is important, but I look at with those athletes, I really prioritize just a tripod in the foot.
Okay.
So the best athletes have a full sensory capacity of the tripod, and particularly the transverse arch area.
Okay.
So by that I mean all the balls of the feet. So not the toes, but the metatarsal heads, all the balls of the feet. And the better your pressure there, the more you can do in many ways. And so, for example, if you have an athlete say, hey, just take your shoes off and stand on one leg.
Yeah.
And we do a lot of just single leg standing. And I think that's one of the most underrated things. Single leg standing and single leg just hopping around in various ways is two of the most underrated things you can possibly do for the feet.
Okay.
Because you see everything. It gives you a huge chance, one, just to watch how people's feet work.
Yeah.
And I think that, it's funny because I look at the fastest guys and girls, and they very often, if without exception, there's stuff they're doing with their foot and lower leg that is different than the slower people. And yet we just, it's not, and once you watch it, I mean, just if you spend a month watching it, it becomes obvious.
Yeah.
But it's not quite as obvious as watching a barbell with plates. That's very easily quantifiable.
Yeah.
So the big thing is, can you access that? And so a real good test of access, well, one, you can go to the doctor's, if you have a foot pressure map, or you go to the Dr. Schultz thing and it can give you a readout and those types of things. But I find that if you have good access, you should be able to stand on one leg and with your bare feet, and you should be able to lift your heel off the ground like a half inch and hold it there.
Okay.
That shows that you have mastery, command of the transverse arch of the foot, the full breadth of the forefoot. And if you have that, you don't compensate as much, you have access to more power, you can do more things upstream. And so like the most explosive guy on my tennis team right now didn't even lift in high school at all. And I'm not pushing him for numbers because he's a tennis player, who cares? He came in and at 5'10", he could almost dunk.
Yeah.
And he's the only guy on the team that can do that for a minute. Everyone else is like 10 seconds tops.
Okay. Wow.
And the guy has like really big, pretty well developed calves, as his tennis players often do, and especially if they play on like clay courts and stuff like that. But you're not going to calf raise your way to being able to do that.
Okay.
It's something that comes from a sensory perspective on the feet. So I want to have them be able to get to the inside edge of their foot, and for that, I'll just call that just that they can pronate. And so the second thing is, can you pronate?
Yeah.
I've had another tennis player who we increased his vertical jump like 2 inches in about 15 minutes by just getting him to pronate, which was when he would go to jump. And so this is another thing is do your athletes, when they're doing that single leg stance drill, do they grip their toes? What's their strategy to stay balanced? If they're gripping their toes a lot, I guarantee you they're not using their arch correctly. They're not sensing the full breadth of the transverse arch. And if you don't have full breadth of the transverse arch access, the heel, the ball of the big toe, and the ball of the little toe, and you may not even need the heel in all situations like acceleration, but if you don't have that, you're not going to pronate right. And so for this particular case, we just use I use Gary Ward's wedges. Or you can use like any wedge. You can use a wedge of cheese. You can use logging wedges. So basically, we used those to help him sense the part of his foot that he wasn't sensing very well, which was the ball of the big toe, and then a little part of the heel. And I just had him basically do the typical knee bend movements we do when we try to do dynamic mobility for dorsiflexion. I don't really do those just for doing. That's another positional thing. Hey, get to this position of dorsiflexion. Oh wait, but we don't talk about how people are pronating. Like
Yeah.
that's huge. You have to pronate because the pronation gives you that extra range in many cases. And
Yeah.
if you're on a supinated foot, it's a bony block. So now you're just stretching the heck out of
Yeah.
tissues in the back of the leg to get there.
Yeah.
So there's another one. So we basically just taught him to pronate for. I teach him to pronate, and then I had him do a drill pushing a physio ball where he had to feel his arches flattening.
Okay.
And we did several rounds of that. Within 15 minutes, his vertical had gone up 2 inches. And
Wow.
vertical in tennis is linked to serving ability, and so
Yeah.
I'd like to think that that could have a positive transfer effect. And then so yeah, I think that if you can pronate, if you can get a flattening of the arch, if you can get all 3 points of contact and don't grip the toes, and you work on that a lot, those give you the keys to be able to doing more things better as a team sport athlete where multi-directional work is required.
Okay.
And even the inside edge in straight linear acceleration, there's still parts that I'm processing because you watch people sprint and I'm like, well, is your ball of your fifth getting down here in this sprint to access pronation? Is it not? Like, I know you need to be strong on that inside blade of the foot, no doubt. And I'll say one last thing before I finish here is I posted on Instagram as Wayne Gretzky. Mike Boyle posted this. It was like Wayne Gretzky.
Yeah, I saw
in his
that.
prime.
Yeah.
Racing Pele, who was not in his prime. Sugar Ray Leonard and Bjorn Borg, who I don't know how old Bjorn Borg, tennis player, who was fast apparently. But Wayne Gretzky just smoked these guys.
Yeah.
And then people are out of the woodwork a little bit on the comments saying, oh, yeah, the hockey guy who's in my gym is the fastest guy.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is they do live on a biases towards inside edge of the foot and to not overextending ankle.
Okay.
Like they don't triple extend, and yet they're the fastest, right?
Yeah.
So it's like it's more about the impulse action and that, I don't know. So maybe our athletes who want to get faster should go in skates or something like that. Yeah, that'll be the next bit.
That's the next. Yeah, the next.
So
training
I hope
pad.
that's just good ideas.
Yeah. Yeah. No. Okay. That's really interesting, and I saw that video, and it was like, how did you get all these people from all these different walks of life together? Like, I want to know a lot of the context, but no, very true, very true. And then with that, right? So your main takeaway would be to help to get athletes to pronate better, right? Get that foot function. And then with that, right, you talked about some specific examples. Would you have any recommendations for working with athletes in a larger group setting, right? So tennis is naturally or typically a smaller group, right? So say you have a group of soccer players. Do you have any like recommendations there? Since we just mentioned Pele, so what would your thoughts be on that?
Yeah. So again, standing on one leg. So this is the most basic thing you can do.
Okay.
It is tough because it is. I'll say two things. One, I don't have huge experience working with large groups in this context, but to try to get athletes to get the idea. So here would be the way I used to do it. Like, and honestly used to do it, meaning 1 week ago, this is what I would tell you. And now I have an addendum because I just talked to Gary Ward, who invented the wedges this last week. So I have an addendum.
Yeah.
The easiest way is just again, single leg, warming up with single leg stance.
Okay.
And I think that I learned this from Dr. Tommy John. I warm athletes up 360 degrees different than I did 7 years ago.
Okay.
I don't do just because I look at what's efficient, what's effective, what's the best use of my time. So again, spending time on one leg. So barefoot, and also how we do sensory inputs to the foot and whatever we're working with makes a difference for the next exercise. And that's, I think, what all our warm-ups are based off of. But so we want to get our feet working well and have that really in the tank before we get to everything else. And even in between stuff too, I think in between sets, standing on one leg and doing like little hip circles with the other leg or perturbations. But standing on one leg and saying, hey, all I want you to do is notice. First, don't grip your toes. Make sure you feel the ball. Pay attention to the ball of the pinky toe, the ball of the big toe, and the heel. So we're going to stand on one leg, and you're going to pay attention. Don't grip your toes, and pay attention to those areas. And the reason I say pay attention is because the old me would have said, well, make sure you try to put contact down on all those 3 areas. But and Gary had just mentioned this. I'm like, you know what, Gary, that's totally true. This is this is getting wheels turning. Is to force to say, hey, I want you to stand and force those balls of the feet down. Could be creating a compensation. Meaning, if the ball toe doesn't naturally go down. Well, forcing anything using the will and forcing it will create a paradigm that's not natural. If that makes sense. And so, Gary's solution is to put something under. Like, let's say I'm standing and you're going around, and if you have soccer, maybe you have 25 or 30 people, right?
Yeah.
And I do have large groups I have groups that are this big, but we swim isn't as much about the feet. So,
Yeah.
but you want to give them chances to sense. And so, for example, what I'll do for swimming in a large group, if I want them to sense their shoulders better and how their shoulders are working in a various drill, something I might do is I might combine like an FRC style scapular drill where they're just moving their scapula around in a range and sensing what their range is. And then right after that, they'll hop up on a bar and do a pull-ups plus, modified version of a pull-ups plus. So we're getting sensation, and then we're going on the bar and we're trying to do something where you can use that sensation. And so it's a little bit tough with team sports, but what I would say, it's like, look, if let's just say take 30 athletes, go line up, stand on one leg, stand on your left leg, be aware of these 3 points. Okay, we're going to go for a minute. Raise your hand, how many of you guys were wobbling and were really just falling onto your pinky toe side all the time? Okay. How many of you guys were really falling onto your big toe side all the time? Now, if you had the means, if you had like either little wedges, it could be pieces of paper, it could be Gary said he used a block of cheese sometime. I mean, anything that has a little bit of thickness and a wedge shape to it, or even roll up newspaper or anything. You could say, okay, I want you to put that on if I was always on my pinky toe side, well, I'm going to put that under my big toe side a little bit, you know? And so that way it's more effortless to have sensory feedback there. And so I don't know if that'd be getting too, I mean, you could also use, even doing soft tissue work too. It could be, this is in one of my courses, neurokinetic therapy, they did the same thing, but instead of giving you sensation, it was like, if I'm always on my big toe side, well, maybe I need to roll out my perineals on, I could do a roller on my perineals, and then I stand again, and now it's just, what do you need to do to make the standing effortless? So you could also do a rolling or soft tissue on whatever side doesn't want to go down, do rolling or soft tissue work on that side, and hopefully it'll go down more effortlessly. And so it's like we're establishing every day with establishing the tripod, establishing the transverse arch. This stuff is critical. So and I'm writing a book on this too, by the way. I've been saying it's going to be out for a long time, but that's the next upcoming one. So maybe in 3 years I'll be the foot guy.
The foot guy, Okay, fair enough. So to put this in some actionable terms, right? You could do the one leg standing thing, right? And then depending on how they bias, you could possibly put them in like, I know a lot of coaches do buckets and put them in groups like pre and post work, and this is something that maybe they could be in smaller groups working on their own with, something like that, right?
Heck yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. No, I think that's really important, because I think we put kids in buckets, right? But a lot of it is like these FMS correctives, which, some of them have some basis and some of them more, have less basis. And so we think we're doing stuff, but now with some actual, kind of data and some actual, experience behind it, I think that's a great way that we could actually create some change, So that's interesting. And then diving back to some of this sprint stuff, right? So we talked about some volume recommendations for plyos in different age groups. What are volume recommendations for sprints in different age groups?
Yeah, right on. I could tell you the recommendation in terms of what not to do for like club track and field, which is just run the heck out of people.
Yeah.
And deal with that. I'm just an assistant. I just work there. I just hang out there.
Yeah.
That's an epidemic. I mean, the track and field's an epidemic to do over too much running. And so I will say this, like, first off, I'll give more like the high-end elite, because I feel like it's easier to give recommendations when someone's on more of an established level.
Yeah.
And so I'll just say this, like, for a team sport that is based off of running, that has hamstring injuries, you want to touch max velocity once or twice a week, but you don't need to do a lot. I mean, maybe like if you just do 30 to 40 meters worth of 10-meter flies, that's probably like just 1 or 2 10-meter flies is a pretty substantial stimulus. And I think we underestimate just how potent that stuff is. So it doesn't have to be a lot. Acceleration, if you're talking track and field, if it's the off season, Charlie Francis would usually do about 250 to 300 meters worth of acceleration work. I think for team sports, maybe 150 to 250 is fine. You don't need to do as much as track if you're not track.
And this is per day, correct?
But go ahead.
This is per day, correct?
Oh, but yeah, per day. Yeah. In a session,
Okay. Okay.
and you'd be looking at maybe 2 of those acceleration sessions a week,
Okay.
possibly 3. But I think 3 of the same thing could yield monotony for a lot of athletes, especially again if it's not your sport.
Yeah.
So that would be like the high end recommendation for like a more advanced group, and then it would just get a little bit lower as the ability level was less. And if it's anything under. I mean, I'm pretty of alignment with Jeremy Frisch on many ways. It's anything under 12. I don't really count any sort of volumes for the most part. To me, it's just all skills and fun, and it's just skills and the judgment behind. I mean, I would never tell. Even if I was doing, I wouldn't tell a group of 10-year-olds, "Hey, we're going to do 200 meters worth of, or 150 meters worth of." That would mean anything to them. They're just like, "How much fun do I get to have today?"
Exactly. Okay.
Yeah. So that's a big one, but the nuance to where I'm going with a lot of this stuff is a sprint at 100% is insanely different than a sprint at 90%.
Yeah.
And a sprint at 90% is insanely different than a sprint at 80%. You could do triple the volume of sprints at 80% that you could at 100 probably. And I like, as I've grown as a coach, and I agree. I think Stuart McMillan's posted a little bit of this on Twitter, like the idea of not going as maximal as often, and versus Charlie Francis talk about being more maximal in intensity and things like that. And what changed the game for me a little bit, Sam Portland was a guest on my show maybe 7-8 months ago. I'm not really sure, but he does speed gate golf, which is a thing where you go for max, you go for a sub-maximal time and try to get as close to that as you can. And he gets guys fast doing that, where they are not running maximally. They just have some technical nuances in mind that they're trying to do, and they just run for a time that's not max. And so if I found anything, the amount of those Charlie Francis recommendations were for maximal velocity stuff. I do way more sub-max speed gate golf stuff that's just a different emphasis now. Rotate a lot more of it to span a greater spectrum, because if you go all max, especially with grinders, they just compensate. They're just like they're hitting those positions in the sprint drills, or they're compensating. It's not. It's kind of it's not what we're really trying to get, if that makes sense. So I think you can actually do more with less volume, or just you frame it different ways.
Okay. No, I like that. And then I know we're getting close on time, so I just wanted to get some stuff in the weight room as well, right, that I picked up from your book, Speed Strength. And so I think is interesting, and so I wanted to just kind of talk about it a little bit. And so to complement some of that stuff that we do on the field, on the track, one of the things that you had mentioned was during Olympic lifts, right, biasing pronation, supination. What are your thoughts on that, and how do you see that, working together with what you do outside of the weight room?
Oh yeah, I'm super glad you asked that, because that's a big one. I would have never thought. It's funny. I mean, I've been working with the Olympic lifts for 20 years now as an athlete and coach, and it's one of those things where, as an athlete, I guarantee when I was 15, learned them on my own, did them in my basement. I remember one time I caught a clean. Yeah. And I almost did the splits because my basement floor was so split. Yeah. I mean, seriously, it was really crazy. Like the weight slammed down on the concrete floor. Yeah. And so, but I guarantee when I was doing it like that, it was all instinctive. And then, again, this is a thing where we just have to be careful with what our coaching cues are doing. Saying, like, if we're saying, okay, get your elbows up at the catch. Well, what is that doing to the whole thing? The biggest thing I'm looking for at Olympic lift is, what is the mechanism that is allowing you to deliver force to the bar fast? Yeah. And so that mechanism has a lot to do with the foot. It's different for everybody, because everyone has different internal and external rotation dynamics and ranges. If you watch, Darian Barr talks about the triangle you see in jumping, where that's inside edge, where like the feet are maybe 12 to 6 inches apart, but the knees are close together, right? And as long as it's good valgus, there's no such thing as good valgus. As long as it's good knees in or knees in to win, that's fine. That's good. You should be doing that. That shows up in my clean too once you get to that second pull. And in the same thing with all like explosive jumpers and those types of things. Someone who's more externally rotated, or more of a Olympic lifter where the goal is not to lift the bar as high as you can. An Olympic lifter's goal is to lift, I think Max Ada told me it was around like maybe 1.6 meters a second or something like that. Yeah. And if you go over that, you're overlifting.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a different paradigm. So you don't need to go inside edge to
Mm-hmm.
get that 1.6.
Mm-hmm.
You just need to get it enough to bump it
Yeah.
and drop. And
Yeah.
so, anyways, that's where there's a difference, though, between doing the stuff for athletes and doing the
Okay.
stuff for Olympic lifters. But I think both are good because a full squat clean has some awesome stuff to it, too. That's good for acceleration. But anyways, I look at the feet when people clean in this manner.
Mm-hmm.
So this is traditional first pull off the ground. I'm in that squatted kind of tight position, knees are over the bar. As the late Glenn Penley had said, the weight's more on the balls of the feet at that point.
Okay.
You have to be. If it's on the heels at that point, you're screwed. Like you can't do anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's so that balls of the feet fits with a little bit more inside edge off the ground. Granted, your knees shouldn't be going inwards off the ground, and they won't be because you're in a squat. But but as soon as you start going to that first pull, you're gonna weight shifting back onto the heels. But this is where I go differently.
Okay.
Is the weight will shift back onto the heels, and some people coach it like that. And then in the second pull, you'll be back to the ball of the feet. But what I find is it's really more, and this fits with sprinting too, is a lot of people are just obsessed with thinking of sprinting as dorsiflexion, plantar flexion. But it's like, no, there's three things going on. There's frontal plane and there's transverse plane. It's really more pronation and supination.
Yeah.
And so trying to put cleans, and again, this is getting into it though. Like if you really want to get into, I'm not convinced you should have to teach athletes this. Like my goal is always to say less. Like the less I can coach. If I get your feet working well in that single leg stance and you're pronating, I should be able to just show you the basic clean, just to cleans, and you should be able to do it without me having to tell you to pronate your
naturally.
Because just going it's in the weeds too much for something. I don't think you need to, especially if it's not your sport. But I will do this. So if I see an athlete going straight heel to heel, or if their toes are even coming off the ground a little bit in that like first pull, I can tell that they're not accessing their feet in a pronation to supination manner, if that makes sense. Like basically, if we just treat it heel to heel, and we're not working pronation to supination, or I just think, look, when you're in that first pull, so that bar is coming up to your knees, you should feel more ball of the pinky toe pressure, because that fits with being on the heel, and it fits with being a little more supinated. As you're getting in that second pull, that pressure is going to shoot right onto the ball of the big toe. And that's where that pronation is going to happen. And then as that bar is being lifted, you're going to resupinate, or the pressure will go it'll go back to the pinky toe in the air, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So the big thing is just that is did you allow the athlete to pronate at the instant of that, like where that second pull was force was being applied for the most part. I mean, it's going to happen fast, and the faster it happens, the better, really. The faster you go from supination to pronation and back again, the better. And one thing Darian Barr mentioned to me, that this is, if I run a 30-meter dash, if I think of anything, it generally messes me up. Sensory cues make me faster, and the one sensory cue that he had told me that made me faster was just pronate and be done with it. Pronate faster. Meaning feel that stretch of the arch of your foot, and as soon as you feel that stretch, you're on to the next step. And that kind of gives you this intro mechanism it works the technique from the arch outwards, because that's the critical point. And so for basically, if you could feel the stretch of the arch real fast, or the getting that big toe, I should say big toe is the ball of the big toe.
Okay.
You go from the pinky toe side to the ball of the big toe side faster. That can get you that impulse faster. But I guarantee if we're doing, if you're Brian Mann doing VBT on the cleans and an athlete's just pulling it faster, they're probably doing that without thinking about it. And that's the best situation. So I think it's just nuance of a coach to say, hey, look, are you using your whole foot, or aren't you? Or are your toes, can I tell that your foot's working like a seesaw, like heel to toe to heel to toe, like that type of thing? That is where I think some sensation should be put in the foot to hopefully optimize what's happening there. But that it just comes back to single leg stance. So it all comes back to single leg stance. I hope that makes sense. I didn't get in the weeds too much.
No, I think that's good. I think it's really interesting, and it's just something you don't hear a lot, and so that's why I really wanted to kind of key in on that, because I think a lot of people will take that as like as like implementation, right? Coaches will want to allow like they think you want to allow valgus or something like that, or some kind of, and so I think it's important to draw that line between the two, right? It's not just a collapse, it's a controlled sequence. And so I think that's really what I wanted to get key in on, and how it's how it looks from your mind. You know, it's a lot different when you just kind of read something and you take it out of context and then you try to apply it. It can get really messy, you know. So yeah, and then one last question. I know we're running out of time here. I really wanted to kind of key in on some of the single leg kind of squatting stuff, right? And so with some of that in your book, you kind of mentioned some you're looking at some anterior translation, and you want some of that in many cases, right? And so kind of coming back to some more, I'd say, conventionally circulated stuff, right? A lot of people might take that as, you know, there's going to be some anterior knee pain or some type of tendonitis. And so how would you kind of explain that to those coaches that are more familiar with that information?
So, single leg squatting in light of like a knees coming in mechanism, is that what you're?
Sorry, more single leg squatting in light of like a anterior translation, right? And allowing and maybe possibly causing tendonitis that way or contributing.
Oh, knees over the toe.
Yeah.
Oh, knees going over the toe.
Mm-hmm.
Right on, right on. Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I could talk about both of those because
Okay.
actually both of them are on my mind. But
Yeah.
the first thing is, so knees coming over the toe is essential. Like you have to.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I was talking about. Like the squat clean has really big benefits because if we can start looking at things, there's general principles. I think in the weight room, there's a myriad of opportunities to look at, and one of it is how fast is the shin dropping.
Okay.
Shin drop happens all the time, but especially in acceleration. And the best accelerators are the fastest shin droppers.
Yeah.
Even the fastest tennis player I have now, who I talked about, how he has the best access to the transverse arch of his foot.
Mm-hmm.
When he does single leg line hops, he does it in a, I guess I'll just say, dorsiflex position.
Yeah.
So his shin is dropped as he does single leg line hops, where everyone else's shin is vertical. And he has an advantage because he's already in that position. He sets himself up in a position to react to the ball faster than everybody else.
Yeah.
And so you have to be able to go there first.
Okay.
And so I'll just say from a health perspective, not everyone's going to be able to go do a pistol squat and shove their knee over their toe because maybe they've been taught to stay away from there. Maybe they're physically devolved a little bit. They just haven't experienced enough movement. Maybe they've had injuries. There's a lot of different reasons, but the first order of business is to make sure you should be able to put your knees over your toes. You know, Ben Patrick and knees over toes guy has really proliferated this, and the idea of just being able to do that. So to prepare people, you could do reverse sled drags, being very intentional about getting a good knee flexion and sissy squats and all these things, and even elevated squats is one of my favorite. I elevate heels on almost all my squats because I want knees to go forward.
Yeah.
I want your shins to drop. If you can't do that, you are less athletic. And so then single leg is where it's like an orchestra. It's beautiful. It all comes together. You have balance. We talk single leg stance, so you have to have single leg stance. Now we have shin drop in a single leg stance. Like this is athletic, right?
Yeah.
And so it's just what happens in sport. And the fastest accelerators I've always had are always the best pistol squatters because they're strong and balanced and controlled in shin dropping, and they have the strength to back that. And so it's essential. You need to get there. But I will say, I'm not like convinced that everyone needs to be foot flat on the ground, pistol squat. Like the ankles do different things. And I think Mike Boyle talked about this, like the idea of doing like a single leg squat on a bench where the other leg can you can hang the other leg down, or elevate the heel. I don't think we need to be super strict and crank dorsiflexion range on people. I just think the one danger I will say of benches is, I mean, I do everything barefoot, but I like solid ground for pistol and single leg stuff where you can really get a good. If it's a soft, like a bench that you do bench press on, it's kind of soft and you kind of stick into it, and it's a way that I don't think gives you the best feedback. So being able to do that is really critical.
Okay, and then to that other point, you were kind of talking about the medial arch with that single leg stance, I believe.
So I just believe in the tripod. I mean, at the bottom of a pistol, you might go medial arch a little bit, and that's fine as long as it's a legal or natural translation and everything's in agreement. So if you're pronating and the knees coming in a little bit, then that's cool.
Okay, and then just the last point on that, right before we kind of end here. So with that kind of process, you haven't seen, or have you had to combat any kind of knee issue in terms of like tendonitis, or would you say anything to those kind of naysayers?
Yeah, I mean, it's just if you're not ready for it, you have to regress. Like if someone's not ready to go there, then they
Yeah.
need to regress into other things, and
Yeah.
and that's fine. Or just go higher. Like
Hmm.
there's no problem with doing a pistol squat to a box
Yeah.
where the box is behind you and you just sit your butt down to the
Hmm.
box, and that's what I would. If we we're doing that, that's where the first place I would typically
Mm.
go, because now you don't. I mean, you want to get all things on the way there. Like
Yeah.
if you just did a bunch of sissy squats and reverse sleds, and that's great,
Hmm.
and then you try to go to full pistol, there might be a balance gap,
Mm.
so a stabilization. So
Yeah.
you get to work the stabilization by just doing lower range of motion
Yeah.
variants of that, and then hopefully you can lower the box over time
Yeah.
and be better off.
That makes sense. Awesome. Okay. Well, I know you got to go. So, last kind of question here. What are some projects you're currently working on, and how can people kind of reach out to you and follow your journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So the biggest thing is probably, I mean, I don't know what's popular. Instagram,
Yeah.
popular, podcasts are popular. So
Yeah.
my podcast is the Just Fly Performance podcast. You can catch me on there with a lot of guests. My Instagram is Just Fly Sports, Twitter Just Fly Sports, and then a website, www.justflysports.com.
Hmm.
And I have a book on the foot, and a lot of stuff. So foot, shoes, proprioceptive training, strength training, the plyometric considerations.
Yeah.
That should be coming out hopefully in the next few months. I've been trying to finish
Okay.
it for a real long time, but
Yeah.
it's been real powerful. So keep your eye out for that. And then obviously Speed Strength, my latest book, is out on Amazon and on my website. So
Awesome.
yeah, those are some ways to contact me with that.
Fantastic. Well, Joe, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. It's been hugely insightful. Every time I hear you talk, it gets the wheels turning. So, thank you again, and I hope to connect again soon in the future.
All right. Awesome one. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.